Hey everyone, this is Whiteflame, also known as Marc. I'm here with Tejretics, and today we're doing an online debate where we've had about 15 minutes to set up on the topic, so we haven't had a lot of time to research this, but that's part of the fun of it. The topic of the day is this House, as Israel, would end compulsory military service. And we're going to do this in 3 separate rounds. Each of us will have 8-minute speeches each of those rounds, with the last round being just wrap up, summary, rebuttal, no new arguments in that. We will have a cross-examination period, 2 minutes after each of the first 2 speeches, where Tej will be able to respond to me. It will be able to ask questions of me for 2 minutes, and then after his speech, I'll be able to ask him questions for 2 minutes, and whichever side wins, let it be the best. So looking forward to it. Just checking in to make sure you're ready, Tej.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to start the clock right now. So let's be clear about what this topic is about. It's this House, as Israel, so we know what this House is, it's Israel, would end compulsory military service. And by end, I mean stop completely. There's no partial measures here. It must be complete. But when it comes to compulsory military service, what that means is essentially a draft system. As long as everyone is required, as long as enough people are required to be part of the military once they reach a certain age, they are part of a compulsory military service. I think this is relatively obvious. So let's get into what the system actually looks like. So first of all, citizens over the age of 18 are required to be a part of the military. And these can be from one of a few different camps, mainly Jewish, also Druze and Circassian, I think it is. Sorry if I absolutely butchered that. But in any case, there are 3 different groups. There are 2 particular groups that get exemptions from this, one of which is the ultra-Orthodox, which get religious exemptions, and Arab groups that are citizens of Israel. There's also some physical and psychological dispensations that can be made, but for the most part, these are the groups that we're talking about. And if you are a male in the country, you have to serve for at least 2 years and 8 months. Some of those get extended by another 4 months, which can mean 3 years. And if you're female, you have to spend 2 years. So basically, if you want to be a citizen, you must enlist. And that's true regardless of whether you're coming into the country as a new person. In fact, if you are an American citizen and you want to get joint citizenship with Israel, you have to enlist at some point in order to fulfill that requirement. So what's my plan? My plan is I will phase out the compulsory system over the next 3 years. The reason I'm setting it to 3 years is because people may currently be enlisted, and I want them to finish out their enlistment period. They're already set up for it. They already know that they're going to be there for that period of time. I want to make sure that they finish that out, but anyone else who's new can refuse. They do not have to join the military. Anyone currently, so yeah, that's what I said actually. Okay, so I have 2 arguments in support of this. So let's talk about individual liberty first. To start, an army is already not representative of the population. Many are unwilling to serve, and many are unable to serve, but more we're talking about the unwilling. To start with, we've got these large populations of Arab people and Orthodox Jews. These represent about 30% of the population. That's already pretty substantial, but when you think about what these actually represent in terms of long-term population, it gets even worse. They represent about 60% of the population that will be born into Israel, which means that they represent the majority of new lives that will be coming into Israel in the future. And these lives will not be conscripted into military service. They are all automatically exempt. But the problem gets a lot worse. We've seen a lot of draft evasions. In fact, this is getting even higher year on year. It used to be 75%, 75% of people who were drafted are enlisted. Now it's something like 50%. There's a lot of people who are absolutely avoiding the draft system, and more importantly, their cases are absolutely ignored. It's too expensive to pursue legal action against all these people, and therefore they don't. And the motivation to join the military and to actually be part of a company in that military has also dropped. It used to be about 90% in the mid 90s. Now it's down to 67%. It's dropped by almost 25%. That's pretty substantial. And so what you're seeing here is a population that's already not going to be a part of the military, and a population that would be a part of the military but is becoming less and less interested in actually doing their duty and being a part of this military enterprise. That's a big problem for military that relies on large numbers of people that it's bringing in. Except here's the fact. They actually don't rely on these large numbers of people. Israel has been changing over for a long time to a smaller force. Now, why would they be doing this? Well, for one thing, it's extremely costly and time inefficient to train a lot of new people. And that's what they have to do literally every time someone gets conscripted into the system. That's a big problem for them, a country that needs an extremely well equipped and extremely well versed force that has, in some cases, 10 to 15 years of experience. That's what makes them a really effective fighting unit if they have that kind of experience. And so that's what the system they're building to is anyway. I don't think there's any real problem with taking these out of the equation, but let's talk a little bit about individual liberty. Because what we're losing here by forcing their conscription is that individual liberty. And on a very basic level, a lot of people in the military will die. Their death toll is substantial, and no one wants to see their child come back in a body bag. That's never a good outcome. That's something we want to avoid regardless. But the other thing that we want to consider is the effect on their continued education and the amount of time that they get to pursue a career of their choice. They're essentially losing out on 2 to 3 years of their life, forced to be a part of this military enterprise that they may or may not agree with. That's something that is substantial and damaging to a lot of people, particularly if they have aspirations to work in other fields and do not require any military experience in order to be effective. That's most of the fields in the world. Lastly, I want to talk about overuse of the military. This is my second advantage. So what does a large army allow for? Well, it allows for more operations. It allows for the army to exercise more military hard power in a broader range. So what does that mean? Well, if you're talking about things like Israeli military settlements, that can be part of the problem. They can essentially just assign a lot of these people to watch over a base and make sure that they don't get that the base doesn't get attacked or that no one tries to do anything about it. Unfortunately, these Israeli settlements are illegal by international law and are damaging to the rights of Palestinians in the area and in the West Bank in particular. There are lots of these. So we need to curb their power. We need to curb their ability to do these kinds of actions. And with that, that's the reason I support this motion. Okay.
Cool.
So I'm going to set the timer for 2 minutes. Just a sec. Okay, so when you're ready, go.
Yeah. In terms of the overuse of the military, why should Israel care about the rights of people who aren't Israeli citizens?
Because the fact of the matter is that Palestinians still make up a very important block of people that live very close and can cause them a lot of damage. They need to and should pursue peace ends, and this is not helping their peaceful ends.
In terms of a large number of people not being covered by the draft, in terms of individual liberty, we already restrict individual liberty in a lot of places. So, for example, we force people to pay taxes to the government, even though it's a substantial restriction on their individual liberty, because we acknowledge that it provides a greater social good. So, if I'm able to prove in my speech that compulsory military service provides a greater social good, does the individual liberty argument still stand? If I prove that.
Even so, there's still an individual liberty harm. Even if there's a social good, you'd have to balance that against the liberty loss.
But just pressing on this a little further, if there's people have an individual liberty to engage in action insofar as that action doesn't cause harm to other people. Would you agree with that principle?
Yes, to a degree.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of it being too expensive to prevent a draft evasion. Okay. What were you trying to prove with the argument on draft evasion?
That they're already doing it, and essentially it's the system that currently includes the draft is not effectively drafting people.
Yeah, so it's not an offensive argument then. It's a defensive argument that compulsory military service doesn't work because people can evade.
It's also causing a lot of enmity against the government, so I wouldn't say it's just defense, but it's somewhat more defensive than it is offensive.
Okay. I will take about, let's say I'm going to take like 10 seconds of my prep time actually.
Okay.
Yep, okay.
So once again, I'll set the timer, but you'll need to set it on your end because I'm going to mute my side.
Yep. So starting with the split, I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to introduce my advocacy. Second, I'm going to explain why it's necessary to promote security among Israeli citizens. And thirdly, I'm going to look at why this benefits the Israel outside of military context. Before that, though, some rebuttal to what whiteflame says. First, he talks about individual liberty, and he says a number of things here. Firstly, he says that this is discriminatory in a way because a large number of people are exempted from the draft. I'm going to quickly explain in my advocacy why a large number of these exemptions will stop in my world, but some of them will continue to remain. Either way, it's not going to be the majority that he claims. Then he says that there's a tremendous risk of draft evasion. There are ways we can prevent draft evasion. For example, we can legally sue people who evade. His response to this is it's way too expensive. But really, just doing it one time is sufficient to deter people in the future from evading in the draft. That's why right now there's an ongoing trend in Israel of draft evasions reducing. But insofar as individual liberty is concerned, there's two things in response to this. The first response is that we already restrict liberty all the time in order to advance the social good. So, for example, we force people to pay taxes to the government because we think that it advances the social good. So if I'm able to prove in my speech that there's actually a greater social good advanced, I'm fine with violating a little bit of individual liberty. Second, Israeli citizens have an obligation to the state. It's a reciprocal obligation that the government is enforcing. That's because the government has provided them with roads, with schools, with bridges, with infrastructure, and with a reasonably high human development index. That means reciprocally, citizens have an obligation to serve the rest of society, and this is just one way through which we force them to do it. On this argument, though, that a smaller force is possibly a better thing, this is some offense that he gets within his first argument. First, he says that it's costly to train a lot of people. Two responses. One, it's plausible for us to simply raise taxes on the richest people in Israel, gain revenue through other ways if this training is really sufficiently beneficial. But two, I'm going to explain in my speech why actually this training has positive economic returns which outweigh this cost. Then he says that it's often inefficient to have a large force. Inefficient to have a large force in combat operations. I think it's plausible for the military to make these strategic decisions on its own. So if it's inefficient to send out a combat op, it's easy, for example, to maintain a certain amount of force as a reserve. Lastly, then on the overuse of the military and furthering illegal settlements, a couple of responses to this. One, This debate is from the perspective of Israel. And I think I should note here that there's a distinction between a topic that says this House as Israel would do something and that Israel should do something. And the distinction here is if whiteflame or I was Israel, what would we do, assuming that Israel acts in its self-interest just as it has acted in the past few decades? So just in terms of resolutional analysis, I think this argument isn't topical. But secondly, even if it was topical, I think Israel has a unique obligation to its citizens compared to citizens of other countries, given that it claims the right to command its citizens through laws, claims the right to tax its citizens, given that it exists in geographical proximity. Thirdly, if the overuse of the military is a problem, notice that I have fiat over Israel in this debate. So I can end illegal settlements and not send the military to supervise those settlements if I think it's harmful. If whiteflame has fiat over Israel, I maintain this right to fiat as well. Two arguments then in this speech. First, before that though, what's my advocacy? I'm going to change the status quo a little bit, which is to say I'm going to ensure that this applies equally to all adults, with the exception of the Orthodox Jews who have a cultural exception, as well as the health exceptions that he talks about. So this applies to Arab groups as well, and it's an equal amount of time that both women, men, and like genderqueer people, if they exist, are required to serve. So I think a lot of his problems in terms of the majority of population won't serve in the future don't exist anymore. So why is this necessary to promote security among citizens? Let's be clear that Israel faces a range of threats in the status quo. I don't think whiteflame contests this, but just let's go over them quickly. First is the risk of terror attacks. So Hamas's regional proximity, its capacity to train fighters, and the fact that it's rebuilding terrorist groups in places like Judea and Samaria is a substantial threat to Israel in the status quo. Israel borders Syria, meaning it faces rocket launches from the Syrian Golden Heights. And it faces the threat of Hezbollah, given that it just borders Lebanon. In addition, it faces a threat of foreign nations. Across it and around it, nations like Iran, nations like the other Arab countries that don't recognize Israel and consider Israel a religious threat. Notice, therefore, there's a political incentive and there is a substantial risk that these nations plausibly attack Israel in the future, given that a dislike of Israel's actions in the past, a dislike of Netanyahu's rhetoric currently. We've seen this happen in the Arab-Israel conflict before. We can't rule out the risk that this happens. Therefore, we think that there is a need for conscription. Why does this need specifically exist? Basically because in the future, there is unlikely to be a sufficiently large volunteer force. And whiteflame gives you this analysis himself when he points out, for example, to the number of people who are trying to evade conscription. That makes it seem likely that in the future, fewer and fewer people will want to join the Israeli military. This has a couple of impacts, right? This means that there's fewer people who can operate tech or exist in supervisory roles, fewer people engaging in strategic roles, fewer people in covert operations, and fewer people in combat operations. Humans specifically are really, really important in military operations because they're able to minimize collateral damage because they can see the situation, and they're more effective in communication. Research has shown this time and time again. But specifically then, conscription is necessary for the Israeli military because there's always a risk that fewer and fewer people join the Israeli military, at which point there's very little it can do. The Israeli military then needs a critical mass of people to ensure that it can effectively carry out military operations and ensure that it has a sufficiently large reserve force. Furthermore, this also, like in the worst case that these soldiers aren't needed, they can simply be kept on the reserve force and trained. There's no harm of having too many people, but an active benefit of having a sufficient amount of people to ensure against risk. This has a couple of impacts. The first impact is most directly, you have the capacity to defend your borders in the event that there's an attack. You have the capacity to deter offensives from other countries in the knowledge that you have a sufficiently large military force. But independently, there's a couple of other impacts of this. The first impact of this is that a large number of people will choose to stay in the military into the future and become the people with 10 to 15 years of training. In addition, it creates political capital to strengthen the military. Because when people join the military, empirically, they often like the military. They form bonds there. They are told to like the military. They become more patriotic. They are a part of this sort of gathering of people who consider themselves the Israeli military. That makes it more likely that there's political support in the future to fund the military, to ensure that it has sufficient technological support, to ensure that it's sufficiently advanced. So on the second argument then, why does this benefit Israel outside of military context? I think there's 4 ways in which it does this. The first is it engenders a sense of patriotism. So being in the military, having commanding officers, having people around you who often care about the military because they're part of the volunteer force, and being part of this general culture makes it more likely you have respect for others and for Israel. You're able to see acts of heroism. You're able to see the threats that Israel faces in the day-to-day. Furthermore, you're likely to have respect for other people. Crucially, military conscription ensures that the military isn't predominantly a bunch of physically fit men. It's also a bunch of people from different backgrounds. From the Arab community, with the introduction of my counterpart, women who are often discouraged by gender roles from joining the military. This kind of diverse interaction makes it less likely that people have stereotypes about other communities and feel more attached to Israel as a concept rather than particular communities within Israel. Second, it creates a sense of discipline, a culture of hard work, a culture of being willing to make sacrifices for your team, which translates into the future. So when you get a job in the future, you have these characteristics. Third, you get skills. So your ability to apply technological skills, for example, ensures that Israel is a hub for innovation. Specifically, Silicon Valley tries to hire former IDF fighters precisely because of the technical skills they gain. Lastly, you gain physical health because you're put through tremendous physical and mental training, meaning your health is preserved into the long run. That's why I'm proud to negate. Cool. I'm open to cross-ex.
Okay. Just a sec. Okay. So let's see. To start, you said that there's an increased respect for other people and for Israel in particular. How do people build that respect simply by being forced into the military rather than choosing that avenue?
So if they join the military, after the process of joining the military, they start, so there's a general culture in which their commanding officers are seen with respect. They're told to respect them. And as time passes, similar to any other kind of long-lasting human contact, it makes it more likely that they follow these rules, and then they realize that, and then they start inhabiting a culture of respect. The same way people who are forced to join school still engender the kinds of benefits of that education because they exist in that culture for a reasonably long period of time. But also, I don't think there's large-scale rates of resentment among people forced to join the military, precisely because they gain the benefits of that and are likely to understand the benefits of that insofar as it's added to the curriculum, insofar as it's a part of their experience within the military.
All right, can you give me some idea of what this critical mass is that's required that they're required to reach in order to be an effective military force?
So you need a certain number of people in order to be a military force, and the risk that there won't be a sufficiently large volunteer force means you should always have a reasonably large reserve force, and therefore the option of conscription on the table. Because if you're able to conscript people and you have that reserve force, if there's a sudden, like in your world, if there's a sudden slump in the number of people who join or a sudden increase in the number of people who leave, it makes it much harder for the Israeli military to sustain.
But currently, do you dispute my information that says that there is already a small expert force built of people who are volunteering over a much longer period of time that are basically used in almost all military operations from Israel?
So number one, I do dispute that in the sense that there are lots of operations that these people go on as well. And the reason the Israeli military sends them on these operations is presumably to strengthen its military force, but also in the long term, presumably the existence of some kind of a risk that this force stops existing is important to ensure for.
Okay.
Ensure again.
So I'm going to take a minute. Okay. That was a little under a minute, but that's okay. I'll make it a full minute. Okay, I'm going to set it for 8 minutes, and let's get started. So thank you to my opponent for his well-constructed speech. And now let's get into some case defense first before I get into his argument. So to start, he says that we can that we can essentially prevent that he can stop most of the exemptions. I will say he leaves off a lot of exemption, and I'm going to get to that on his case, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The fact that these exemptions continue to exist under his plan for a large number of people is still part of the problem, and it still sends the message that some people are fine not to do this, while other people, because they are less religious, are effectively able to get away with, are effectively unable to get away with the same kind of behavior. So he talks about reducing the reduced enlistment and the draft dodging. He doesn't really explain this in a reasonable way. He says instead that, okay, well, we can police some of this and just slap a few people's hands, and by doing that, we scare enough of the people beyond that. I disagree. I don't think there's any meaningful way for the Israeli government to respond to this without engendering a tremendous amount of enmity from the people who are doing it, first of all, and second of all, without getting the exact opposite response, because people are just as likely to respond to this with more reason to absolutely hate the Israeli government and find reason that they should not join the military because they don't want to be under the thumb of the oppressive rule of a government that is trying them for trying to exercise their individual liberty. But then he talks about how they already he says how they're obliged to serve the state and serve society. He doesn't say how they're obliged to do this specific service. These people already pay their taxes. These people are already part of society. Why is this specific service the one that they have to provide? He keeps talking about the need to do a service for your government, but the US doesn't require this kind of service. Why should Israel require this service? The only requirement here should be that they contribute to society in a meaningful fashion, that they defend the basic aspects of society. They shouldn't have to fight and die for their society in order to be an effective servant. But let's talk about this. He keeps going through when he talks about his response to it's ineffective or too expensive to train troops. First of all, he's not responding to the ineffective aspect. What that means is that you get a fresh-faced new recruit every single year, and you have to deal with them every single time for almost all of your troops. Even if you have a lot of money, you still have to train all those troops. That is taking a tremendous amount of your time away from other operations. You are required to pull people from the field who have experience in order to train all these troops. And you need a certain number of those experienced people to train each of those large numbers of unexperienced people. It doesn't matter how much money they have, this isn't going to resolve it. But beyond that, raising taxes on the rich is not a plank of his plan. He talks about how it might be, but just because it might exist doesn't mean it actually does. He's still not dealing with the actual flaw of not having the money to do this. And the fact is, even if he says, oh, we're going to raise tax on the rich, by how much? How much is that going to cover? He doesn't explain any of the specifics of this. Then he says training it engenders positive returns. I'll get to that on his case. He talks about how a large force is just generally better for implementing military actions. He doesn't really get into this in a meaningful way until he gets to his case, so I'll get to it there. So let's talk about the Israeli settlements. I think a lot of his response is just dismissive. He doesn't actually address the points that I'm bringing up. Instead, he just says this is not in Israel's self-interest. Well, the fact that Hamas is attacking over the border is in their self-interest, so the fact that Palestine still has an axe to grind with Israel is definitely in their self-interest, and reducing that threat from Palestinian forces, especially in the West Bank, where there are more people who are usually on Israel's side and would otherwise be entirely docile and reasonable, by basically allowing these settlements to be guarded and become these massive international escapades against them is not good. But beyond that, what's also in their self-interest is garnering international support. And they don't garner international support by violating international law, by taking action in another state that's separate from theirs. He talks about how they're obliged to the citizens over others. I would say that obligation is met by ensuring that the Israeli settlements aren't protected. And he says that we can end the Israeli settlements by other means. Well, he doesn't talk about what those other means are. He doesn't talk about what his actual plan is. He can say that he can fiat it, but he doesn't actually fiat it, and he doesn't explain what that fiat actually looks like. It's not like it's just going to, oh, we're going to remove all these settlements. He doesn't actually say what they're going to do. So unless and he's far too late to explain that at this point. So let's talk about his plan. He says that it applies to all adults, excluding the Orthodox. I don't know how this solves for the problem. He's just including the Arabs instead, and for some reason that's supposed to solve for the loss. Realistically, the Orthodox are still a large part of the childbearing public in Israel, and they're still a really important aspect to this. So he's just minimizing. He's just trying to partially solve for the problem. Partial solvency is not solvency. So he talks about how all foreign nations are a risk to, all the surrounding nations are a risk to them, and that Hamas is building terrorist groups. He doesn't ever explain why they need a conscripted force in order to respond to this. He talks about this critical mass argument, but he never talks about the actual number of people. And I will repeat a point from my case that I still don't think he's responded to very well. Israel is almost exclusively utilizing a small force of military to do pretty much all of their military operations. There is no need for having this large force that does not have enough training and is not capable of going on these combat missions, despite what he says is the case. So he says that it is capable of defending borders. As far as he provides no warrant for this, he provides no examples of where a large force was required in recent memory to defend Israel. Many of its neighbors are now allies of Israel, or at least neutral towards Israel. And the ones that aren't, like Iran and Syria, are embroiled in their own problems. They haven't levied any kind of attack. He gives you no reason to believe that either of these countries will engage in any kind of attack when anything changes with regards to their compulsory service, or that they will engage in any case. So he talks about other benefits. He says respect for others in Israel. I would say that conscription actually reduces that respect. It ensures that these people feel trapped in these positions and feel like they have no recourse and no reason to do anything. That's the reason why their enlistment has decreased to 50%. They've gone down because they feel like the system is hurting them. As for discipline, hard work, skills, physical health, these are things they can acquire in all number of other places. They do not require conscription to get them.
I'll take 2.5 minutes, actually. No, 2 minutes. I'll take 2 minutes for now. Um, here. I'm ready. Just one second. Let me just organize my notes. Yeah, and 8 minutes. So I'm going to organize this speech by first talking about the military need for conscription. Second, by responding again to the things in whiteflame's case that need a response. And then third, looking at the remaining material in my case. So first, just in terms of a broader overview, like what is the specific short-term military need of conscription? Because whiteflame keeps challenging the solvency of conscription, this idea that we need conscription. What does he say in terms of this justification for this? First, he says that Israel uses a small force of elite soldiers in the vast majority of its military operations. There's a number of responses to this. One, I just want to point out that this is purely an assertion with absolutely no warrant. We've seen time and time again Israel use its conscripted force in a variety of operations. For example, its usage in the invasion of Lebanon was a large number of conscripted individuals from the Israeli force. Secondly, notice that even if it is a small force right now, we need to motivate a reasonably large number of people to stay within the Israeli military. That is, the best people within this conscription, the Israeli Defense Forces pick and encourage to stay in exchange for pay, and a lot of people do this. Thirdly, I want to point out that in a variety of circumstances, what we need to do is insure against risk. Specifically, there's two kinds of risk I said we need to insure against. Even if this risk is unlikely to happen, the sheer magnitude of the risk justifies us in terms of insuring against it. The first is a plausible future in which the number of people enlisting within the Israeli military substantially reduce. And there's a number of reasons why this could happen. One, after the abolition of conscription, the state could simply be sending the message that we don't need you within the military, so a lot of people don't feel obligated to serve in the first place. Second, I just want to point out that a lot of people don't really like the idea of joining the military, and a lot of them realize that they like the idea of joining the military after conscription, and prior to conscription don't really consider it as a prospective option. Therefore, we not only need to ensure that there's a reasonable number of people who are within the conscripted force, receive a certain amount of training, and then decide to stay as the best people there and receive even more training to become part of this elite force. And we need to ensure that there's a reserve force in the event that enlistment falls. But the second kind of risk we need to insure against is defense against potential threats externally, from Iran and from Syria. I agree that they have their problems right now. But one, what whiteflame isn't considering is the future. And two, even a low probability impact is still a really important one because of the sheer magnitude of Israel not having the capacity to defend itself against an attack. So what does whiteflame say in terms of inefficiency? First, he said that there's an opportunity cost, that often the best soldiers are now going to be pushed into training these soldiers and are therefore not really useful. The problem with this argument is, one, we pointed out that this often pays for itself in terms of military technology. We give you two warrants for this in my speech that whiteflame simply doesn't address. One is the idea of an increase in political capital to fund the military, which is once you join the military, you feel a sense of attachment and commitment to it, and therefore you want to spend more on the military. His response to this is simply backlash. But the problem with backlash is that in many cases, we think it's not true. That is, even if people initially resent the state for conscription, once conscription becomes a part of culture, this backlash substantially reduces, particularly because if you spend a particular amount of time in the military and are inculcated within the military culture, within even the military propaganda, it makes it less likely that you experience this kind of backlash and more likely that you support the military. But second is the economic benefits, which I'll get into in a moment, which can be used to spend into the military if that's really necessary. Therefore, conscription is necessary in order to ensure that Israel is able to insure against the risk of future drops in enlistment, ensure that the military is sufficiently strong to last well into the future. Then let's look at whiteflame's case, right? First, on draft evasions. Like he says, there's no meaningful way to respond to draft evasions without spending a lot of money. Like, frankly, I'm willing to spend that money to crack down on draft evasion. If that creates a deterrent, that's perfectly fine by me. Next, he says that there's no clear reason why this is the specific way in which Israeli citizens should serve their obligation to their country. But I never made an offensive argument about obligation to your country. All I said is that it is justified, not obligatory for the government to do this, but justified for the government to violate individual liberty in this way. This was a purely defensive response to whiteflame's argument that he misinterpreted. But ultimately, if I prove that there's social good resulting from this, his argument from individual liberty doesn't really stand. Then he says this is too expensive. I pointed out that there are various things I can do by means of fiat in order to make up for these costs in the short run. His response is that raising taxes on the rich, for example, is not a plank of my plan. And he says this at another point as well. So I just want to deal with how fiat works once again, right? Because I don't think this debate is necessarily a comparison of two very specific advocacies. Rather, this debate is more generally whether Israel should end military conscription. If I'm able to defend an advocacy, even if I didn't have this advocacy all in the same two lines of my speech, to suggest that Israel should not end military conscription, insofar as I defend some version of that advocacy, is sufficient for me to win this debate. It's whiteflame's burden to prove to me why it's not. But then he says that these people are often inefficient in combat. But I actually responded to this in my previous speech when I said that the military is able to prioritize. That is, if there's a large ineffective group, it is able to just keep them as a reserve force and not utilize them in combat operations at all if that's what necessary. It's able to train them and dedicate resources towards training if that's what necessary. And the military makes these kinds of decisions all the time. So it's unclear why the military can't make this decision in this instance. But I also pointed out that the long-term benefits of this in terms of producing more skilled, better soldiers for the military in the future and ensuring against tremendous risk probably outweigh the cost of maybe a couple of our experienced soldiers engaging in this kind of training, especially when after some period they can take part in military operations and do take part in military operations. But then he says that this results in the overuse of the military, this results in backlash from Hamas and threatens Israel potentially. I pointed out that, again, it is in my fiat to change the way the military acts. He says I don't explain what this fiat is, but I just want to point out that there is no plank of whiteflame's plan that says that the military shouldn't protect settlements either. So if that's whiteflame's standard, he loses this offense as well. Ultimately, whiteflame recognizes that he has the fiat to do this within his argumentation. I have the fiat to end the protection of settlements if that's what I want to do. I'm happy to end the protection of settlements. That's really not a part of this debate. So then let's look at the material I introduced to you in my speech, right? Because I introduced to you an argument structurally about why this is essential for the acquisition of particular kinds of skills. This is essential to create a patriotic attitude. Whiteflame has two responses to this. One is the direct response in the last 10 seconds of his speech, that they can acquire skills in other places. He never specifies what these other places are. I think the military is a great place to acquire skills because you feel a sense of duty within the military, which is inculcated by the culture around you, by your commanding officer, by the propaganda that the military uses, by the sense of camaraderie that makes it more likely that you pick up this whole combination of skills. Furthermore, I pointed out that the sense of patriotism is actually unique to the military because you get to see people in the military doing things like engaging in heroic actions, which engenders patriotism even more. In terms of his backlash response, I've already dealt with this earlier in my speech. But what does he say in response to my actual argumentation on the military itself? He says that my plan doesn't really work because there's still a large part of the Israeli population that isn't going to be conscripted. I want to point out that this is mostly a mitigatory argument. Like the Arab population in Israel also has a reasonably high fertility rate. We're happy for that population to continue being conscripted into the military. In the future, if it becomes a problem, the government can pass restrictions preventing this as well. It's up to them to do that. But then he says that I never at any point explained why conscription specifically is necessary. But the problem is that enlistment, for the reasons I described earlier in my speech, is likely to go down, and we need a way to ensure against that risk. The largest magnitude in this debate is ensuring that Israel has a sufficient number of people to carry out its operations and the capacity to engender skills that enable innovation into the future. Insofar as I've proved that, I'm proud of it.
All right. So I'm going to take my remaining 3 minutes. Oh, no, 4 minutes. I have 4, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I have 4 minutes. I'm going to take those to just get myself organized, and I'm starting right now. All right, that's my time. Okay. Gonna start my clock right now. So once again, I'd like to thank Tej for solid debate. I've really enjoyed this, actually. I'm going to start with a bit of an overview, and then I'm going to get into my 3 questions that I'll be answering. Those questions are, what does conscription actually provide? How have people responded to conscription? What's the actual response to its implementation? And what does it mean for Israel? What does conscription actually mean for Israel? So starting with the overview, I think it's really important that we just nail down this fiat thing that we keep hearing about, because this has been going all over the place. Khan keeps wanting to include planks to his argument as part of his speech. And maybe he's just saying, oh, well, we could do these things, or we could do these things. He's talking in the abstract. These are not actual portions of his plan. They're not specified. They're very unclear. They're not part of his counterplan text. And as he himself pointed out, they're atopical. The settlements have nothing to do with the specific implementation surrounding this plan, because we're talking about conscription. We're not talking about the settlements. So these can't be a part of his plan. We're talking about the benefits and negatives of removing conscription. It's that simple. So any part of his plan that doesn't have to do directly with that is not going to apply in this debate. So let's talk about what actually happened in this debate. And to start, we need to talk about, what does conscription actually provide? So I've pointed out in some detail that there is a lack of people who are joining the system. And in many cases, they're just allowed out. Now, his counterplan to essentially force the same conscription on Arabs doesn't resolve this. He's still running against the same wall, because Orthodox families still produce a lot of the children in Israel. So he's just changing the position of the walls to slightly later. So his system may run afoul of the very critical mass argument he's making. He just doesn't explain when that critical mass will be lost on his end, and explains that, and seems to believe that it'll be lost on mine. But I agree, required participation does increase the number of troops in the system. So let's talk about why that matters. How have people responded to conscription? I really want to highlight a point that my opponent said. He said that as long as conscription is part of the system, it becomes part of the culture. And because it's part of the culture, it reduces backlash. Let me analyze that for more than 2 seconds. He's talking about a system that has been in place for more than half a century that is somehow either not part of the culture now or is part of the culture and is still engendering this backlash, in fact, is engendering it worse today for the fact that it has been in place for so damn long. So the backlash response he gives is actually turned against him. What he's doing is increasing the backlash by doubling down on this policy, by expanding it to other groups. He is fundamentally making it worse, and for that matter, by increasing the amount of time that we're on it, he's ensuring that that system will continue to work against the basics of culture and the wishes of this population. Their individual liberties, even if they are, as he says, lesser importance than how he may view their obligations, these individual liberties being lost means that their backlash is felt even more. And that's where you get these responses to discipline, where they become unruly and difficult to control. You get the disrespect for culture, the disrespect for Israel, the disrespect for other people that they're forced into interactions with rather than allowed to join as part of that camaraderie, as part of that group. But the main thing that I feel like he just does not address is the basic fact that, yes, many of these people are going to die. He even brings up the perfect example of the Lebanon invasion, where hundreds upon hundreds of soldiers were killed, many of whom were brought in as American citizens who were trying to pay aliyah to Israel and were therefore trying to become citizens of Israel by being a part of the Israeli military. Those citizens died in their trip there. They were brought home in a body bag. Their loss of liberty is absolute. That damage is absolute. And much as he talks about this extremely, even if it's an extremely low probability of some massive invasion, he doesn't give you any reason to believe that there's any probability whatsoever. He can just try and, he never tells you about an imminent invasion from Syria, a reason to believe that Iran's going to attack them. He just talks about previous conflicts as though somehow that's a justification for future conflicts. He gives no reason to believe these things will happen. So yes, the possibility of a future invasion is terrible. And the fact is, Israel has managed to deal with all of them. He gives zero reason to believe that they cannot handle any future invasion, but much more importantly, he gives no reason to believe that a future invasion is imminent, probable, anything. So let's talk about the last question. What does it mean for Israel? At best, you're giving him that he talks about these discipline increases, these increased skills, maybe the increase to military tech and investment in Israeli tech. That's decent, I guess. He doesn't give any specific examples of how that's important. He doesn't weigh that against life loss. He doesn't weigh that against the damage to Israeli culture. So he gives no reason to believe that this is better. I would say that death is the greater impact. I would say that the certain death of so many Israeli soldiers is definitely the greater impact. And by the way, let's talk about that Lebanese case. That Lebanese case was the result of an invasion. If Netanyahu did not have access to all those troops, he probably would not have invaded Israel for the same reason that he probably wouldn't be guarding every single settlement in the West Bank if not for the fact that he had all these things. And that's one other point on fiat that my opponent doesn't seem to understand. I'm not fiating that they're not going to guard these settlements. I'm saying that they won't have the troops to make that decision. They won't be able to defend those settlements. They'll have to do something different, which means that my case actually does affect settlements, whereas his case does not. But when it comes to Israel in general, the main thing that I'd like to get across is the actual effect worldwide. Israel does not get a lot of support in this day and age because of the way they're viewed, because of the way they treat other cultures in their region, particularly the Palestinians. In the event that Israel is forced to remove itself from those settlements, they suddenly become a lot more tenable to those cultures and get a lot more of that support and defense that they lack. And therefore, they're able to defend against those external threats. They're able to defend and able to improve themselves militarily in the process.
Cool. I will take the last 3 minutes that I have.
Sounds good.
Just 1 second. Yeah, I'm just starting the timer. Hold on. Yeah. Yep. So I'm just going to steal whiteflame structure. First have an overview and then look at 3 questions this round comes down to. So in terms of the overview on fiat, so whiteflame expects that any exercise of fiat that I have in this round be specifically stated in the counter plan in the first 15 seconds of my speech. But there's a couple of reasons why this understanding of fiat is a strange one in light of the responses that I gave. The first thing is that a lot of my responses were not that Israel should do this now, but rather that Israel has the capacity to do this in the future. So, for example, if whiteflame raises a problem, or for example, backlash from Hamas due to the protection of settlements, then it is likely that Israel sees the potential of this backlash and therefore, even with these additional troops, doesn't send troops to protect settlements in the first place. Therefore, it is unclear to me why this kind of fiat doesn't exist in terms of Israel potentially in the future, once a threat exists, taking action to neutralize it. Secondly, I want to point out that this is an unfair double standard because whiteflame also exercises fiat across his speeches without putting them in his plan. The key example that I gave you was the one about him not using soldiers to protect settlements. So in his third speech, he says, actually, the issue is that Israel will not be able to send soldiers to protect settlements in a world without conscription. But the problem with that is it is unclear why settlements are the specific area from which Israel will cut the use of soldiers in military operations once conscription ends. He never gives you a reason why. The only reason is if whiteflame uses the fiat to stop protecting settlements after the end of conscription. Thirdly, though, resolutional analysis, which is that this is a debate about what Israel ought to do, not a specific comparison about one plan from whiteflame and one plan from me. More generally, as whiteflame himself points out, it's a debate about the benefits and harms of conscription. I've proven that the harms vastly outweigh. So I'm going to look then at these three questions. The first is the experience of the military, whether people actually dislike or like conscription and like their experience within the military dealing with this stuff on backlash. Second, how this affects military operations. And third, how this affects Israel more generally. So firstly, on the military experience. His argument basically has been that there will be tremendous backlash and alienation from people who didn't really want to go. Many responses. One, at no point did whiteflame actually quantify or prove that this backlash existed beyond asserting it, particularly in light of the facts that 73% of the Israeli population right now, for example, supports conscription. If there was really such a large-scale backlash in a democratic society like Israel, it's unclear why this conscription was not repealed already. But second, I pointed out that this often becomes a part of culture, right? And he says, oh, but if that's the status quo culture, why is there still backlash? But there isn't actually nearly as much large-scale backlash as whiteflame characterizes is the case. It's unclear to me why, if this is a part of education and a part of your culture, you won't accept conscription as a reality. Thirdly, I pointed out that empirically, conscription does things like increase social capital in a range of different ways. And the reason this happens is because when a soldier is conscripted into the military and goes through the training process, they are taught into a culture of camaraderie, similar to the way they would be taught in a university or in schools. They are taught into a culture of listening to their commanding officer, of seeing other people perform heroic acts within the military, and start seeing the military as a social institution that provides them close, tightly knit communities and friends and people they see as a part of who they are as a person, and are therefore more likely to empathize with other people within the military, more likely to actually respect Israel as a nation and respect Israeli culture. Specifically because, insofar as there is a repetitive narrative of patriotism reinforced within the military, as I pointed out in my first two speeches, it is likely that they become more patriotic. The impact of this specifically is that there is more political capital to do things like fund the military in the future, train more people to a substantial enough degree to become part of Israel's elite force of operatives, which turns whiteflame's argument on the opportunity cost involved in training that he later kicks in his third speech. So second, let's talk about the most direct military effects of this. So he asserts in his first and second speeches that really it's just a small elite force within Israel doing the majority of operations. I pointed out that this was an assertion that was likely false in my second speech, no response in his third speech. But as a result, what my point is that there is a large number of soldiers, including from this force, who are used in military operations currently to neutralize threats. So frankly, there is a risk of conflict and is a risk of attacks on Israel in the status quo. He challenges the probability of this risk. But the problem is he never at any point engages with the examples I gave you in the first speech for why this risk exists. For example, Hamas training soldiers and carrying out attacks in places like Judea in the status quo means Hamas is mobilizing for a conflict and will mobilize in a conflict well into a future. Why then is conscription specifically necessary? Whiteflame asks. But I gave you this answer in my second speech when I pointed out that the number of soldiers who voluntarily enlist within the Israeli army is likely to continually reduce after the implementation of this policy, both due to the messaging warrant I gave you and due to the people simply don't particularly want to be part of the military, even if they don't actively resent it warrant I gave you in my second speech. No response to this either. So if enlistment goes down in the future, which is likely, and if Israel faces some threats from things like terrorism, the capacity to engage in counter-terrorism operations is going to depend on some less elite soldiers being there to carry out things like cyber operations and so on. But crucially, in my second speech again, whiteflame doesn't respond to this, often to become part of the more elite 15-year trained part of the Israeli military, often the people who are conscripted in their 2 years, members of the IDF and commanding officers spot them and pick them out to be long-term members of the Israeli military. They often consent into this, and therefore the current elite force comprises people who you would not have gotten without conscription because they decided that they wanted to be a part of the military afterward. I gave you this offense in my second speech, no response. But what does he say? First, he says opportunity cost. Like, I've already responded to this, especially with the turn on political capital to fund the military. Then he says protecting settlements is a bad idea. But in my first speech itself, even though it wasn't explicitly in the part of my speech titled Counterplan, I explicitly said that Israel should not use its military to protect settlements. That's part of my advocacy in this debate. He doesn't engage with that. Then he says this increases the risk of intervention. We saw this in Lebanon. But at no point does he explain why the intervention that happens is unnecessary. Often it's necessary intervention. The Israeli military apparatus has the intelligence necessary to conclude if an intervention is important. And in fact, the lack of conscripts and a weaker military force, that's a concession. Because the lack of conscripts and a weaker military force makes it less likely that Israel is able to carry out necessary interventions against potential threats to the state of Israel. Then he says that there's a high risk of evasion, so you don't really get your benefits. Plus, people within the Orthodox Church are a large part of the population. Like, in the status quo, 74% of Israeli citizens have conscripted at some point. I think it's a reasonably large number of people. This is mitigatory at best. The impact of this is that there is less military operations in his world to engage in counterterrorism operations that can save Israeli lives, that can save the lives of citizens in the West Bank, that can save the lives of actual people. But thirdly, then, let's look at the effects on Israel more generally, because I pointed out that you get technical skills, you get patriotism, and you get social capital, specifically in the context of being able to interact with people of diverse backgrounds. He just says this doesn't weigh compared to the loss of lives of soldiers. But actually, it does weigh compared to this, because while soldiers sign up, fundamentally, because economic growth often means a reduction of future Israeli poverty that lasts a very long period, and the military becomes more capable with more money. This outweighs individual liberty. But the fundamental weighing here is that Israel's capacity to engage in counterterrorism operations and operations to prevent attacks in the future are a really large impact, because they impact the lives of Israeli civilians who are often killed as a result of this. That is the largest impact in this round, and an impact that I am the only one who's able to prevent. Very proud to negate.